But why don't we just jump in? We don't have a break schedule between these roundtables, and just have the panelists introduce themselves and also give us an elevator pitch summary, short summary of their paper published in the special issue. So Xénia, if we can start with you, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Xénia Farkas from Hungary, from the Center for Social Sciences and from the Corvinus University of Budapest. And it is an honor to be here today. Thanks for the organizers. Our article with Marton Bene is about images, politicians, and social media. And we identified and compared the patterns and effects of Hungarian politicians' image-based communication on Facebook and Instagram during the Hungarian parliamentary election campaign in 2018. We adopted a cross-platform comparative approach and examined the engagement effects of visual cues by applying a combination of inductive and deductive qualitative content analysis. We created a visual coding scheme that is suitable to, firstly, to investigate images as objects of interest on their own. Secondly, to explore political actors' visual personalization strategies. And thirdly, to compare visual strategies on different social media platforms. And finally, to investigate the effects of different images on user engagement. And our results show that visual political communication is strongly personalized both on Facebook and Instagram, but the level of personalization is higher on Instagram. And further, while on Facebook, the individualization dimension of personalization is more common and popular, on Instagram, its privatization dimension prevails. Furthermore, on Facebook, users like more politics-related, candidate-centered images, but on Instagram, we couldn't find similar effects for more informal visuals. And basically, that's about our article.
Great, thanks for that. And let's move on to Jenny. If you could introduce your paper, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Jenny Lindholm. I'm from Akademi University in Finland. It's evening here, hence this darkness around me. And one of my co-authors, Tom Carlson, is also joining us here today. So to pitch our study, I would say that when you ask people if they think that private photos or public photos of politicians on Instagram are more interesting, most people guess it's the private photos that we want to look at. But however, in our study, we actually found that people paid more attention to the public photos of party leaders. And those photos, they were also more effective in communicating positive leader trait perceptions. So you should read our paper if you're interested in how Instagram images can affect leader evaluations. And then also, what is it actually in these photos that we look at? We did eye tracking analysis of that. And then I would say that another interesting part is if there are gender differences between how we look at and evaluate female and male party leaders. And I won't tell you the results here, but you can read all about it in the paper.
Little teaser there, thanks. That'll give people an incentive to check out your paper. Ricardo, could you give us a little introduction?
Hello, everyone. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you for organizing the symposium and the special issue. So the 90-second presentation of the paper, so the paper is co-authored by Renato Caetano, and we are both from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And we analyzed Instagram posts by Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who is one of the exponents of the right-wing neo-populism. And by looking at his Instagram posts, we applied a matrix that attempts to look at how he performs, attempting to mirror the people, to perform some sort of distance and extraordinariness, and to appropriate symbols of power. And in analyzing these images, we came to a result that his image is marked by eccentricity and unsophistication, which makes his performances, bodies, and the appropriation of institutional power function as a series of parodies. So the concept of parody is at the key of the article, and we discussed the inherent ambivalence of the idea of parody. In emptying the presidency from its extraordinary dimension, he somehow builds something extraordinary by playing with the ambiguities of these parodies. So it is this rejection of social standards, of his everyday improvisations that project an image of an ordinary man occupying the presidency, and that in a certain way reshapes the whole idea of the institution that he is occupying at the moment. So we discussed theoretically this idea.
Terrific, thanks. And Felix, I think your paper was already introduced by Scott. Unfortunately, Andrew Ross and Adita Bhatia weren't able to make the panel, but Felix has gladly stepped in. He's from the Internet Institute at Oxford. But Felix, if you could just describe kind of your experience maybe in journalism covering populists and your perspective on that, go ahead and make a kind of a 90-second introduction, if you will.
Kind of unprompted. Yeah, hi everyone, and yeah, thanks for having me. What Erik just said, basically, I used to work in journalism as a freelance journalist, and I originally hail from Germany, which has quite an interesting history when it comes to right-wing populists, because we didn't really have them until sort of the refugee crisis in 2015, and after that, it really became sort of a major issue, and also quite strongly affected how German journalists do their work and sort of have to go about covering these groups and covering their voters. And well, what can I say? It's been a difficult ride. Generally, I think most German journalists by now sort of have found a way forward where they try to cover them fairly and accurately without giving, especially sort of the firebrands, too much oxygen to speak with Whitney Phillips and sort of to bring their points too much into the public arena. But it's still a tricky issue, and it sort of brings to the fore many of the long-standing problems within the German media system, which is for one sort of an East-West division, where a lot of journalists come from the West or hail from the former West of Germany, but a lot of the populists and populist supporters are usually from the East, so which kind of creates an interesting dynamic. And yeah, I think on average we've probably fared a bit better than some other countries when it comes to covering populists, but I wouldn't say that we've done greatly, and there's a lot to learn for journalists.
I like your phrase, a difficult ride. I could definitely sympathize with that now. The other issue is, you know, the extent to which you give populist platforms, because they're so predictable and, you know, so kind of only partially committed to the truth, that if you allow them, you know, airtime, do you just engage in kind of misinformation yourself? And then, so that raises the question about visual analysis. So assuming, I think what did Christian say, we all had 48 hours in the day and 14 days in a week, what kind of analytical leverage would visual analysis of populism and populist actors provide that we don't already have now? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? Another way of thinking about it is, why not just stick with analyzing populist discourse and what they say and leave it at that?
I can go first. So I think that some of the core features of populism, they can be communicated visually. So if we look at, you know, the true people, like evoking positive emotions of pride and enthusiasm, that these kind of images can be like the party leader is an ordinary guy, part of the not a traditional politician. And then also another core feature is the conflict between the corrupt elite and the people. And I think that can also be communicated visually, like the deception of elites and how elite behavior can be put in a negative light. So showing consequences of corrupt elite actions to the people, appealing to emotions of anger. And then maybe the third point could be the in-group versus out-group, like we, the people, and maybe them, the immigrants, and the out-groups are then maybe depicted as threats, both culturally and economically. So there are negative advertising with visual cues of outgroups to evoke fear. So I think populism is a lot about emotions, and emotions are very good, are communicated visually very often, I would say, as a starting point.
Ricardo, what are your thoughts on that? Could you have done your analysis even for your paper only looking at the visual, the verbals?
I don't think so, and I think I could answer with another question. Why not? Because I think that political science and political communication most of the time focuses on discourses because it is thought to be easier to analyze. But thinking of an age of spectatorship, communicative abundance, it doesn't make really sense to reduce analysis to texts and to words. So it is this multidimensionality of communicative performances that requires attention in order to build a broader picture of what we're talking about. So I believe that by not looking at images, we're just reducing the phenomenon to a very simplified version of it. And more specifically, and to conclude, there are specific elements that you can only see through visuals, like the emotional tones, the way the aggressive speech become materialized into and embodied into performances. So although I think that visuals should be employed to analyze politics broadly, in populism, it seems particularly relevant due to the visual dynamic of populist performances.
Xénia, what are your thoughts in this regard? In Hungary, there's been a populist turn of late.
Okay, I just wanted to shortly add something to what Ricardo mentioned, that this unadapted added value of visuals in communication in general, and specifically in populist communication. So the visual aspects convey messages that can be articulated as part of the verbal messages and populist discourse. So the images can even modify the verbal messages, and thus it is really important to not to ignore, but to investigate visuals. Okay. Did you have any other question related to Hungary, or that I missed?
Well, what have you noticed in the Hungarian context recently in relation to politics? Have they become in any way more visual or more performative?
Well, definitely more visual. But maybe I'm saying that because I'm investigating visuals, but I guess populists are strong in visual communication in Hungary, and we have like really strong emotional images from populist parties.
And Felix, let me kind of shift it a little bit and talk about disruption, right? Because that's kind of one of the strategic aims of the style, is kind of an incivility, a negativity, an emotionality. So if we're looking at the visual aspects of this, what kind of insight might we get in terms of spotlighting this kind of norm violation, the othering of people not like us, and really the aggression? And how might that even play out journalistically, since you have some of the background in that?
I wonder how to understand your question, but let me put it that way. Basically, it's with images. I think the reason why we have to pay attention to them in a sort of populist context is because they sort of allow you to tiptoe around contentious issues. And as a populist, basically, or as a populist supporter, you can actually get away, I would say, with more in visuals, because you don't explicitly have to say certain things, and people will still get your message. And that, of course, sort of means a special responsibility for journalists if sort of journalists cover populists or populist messages. Because of course there's a certain interest in say, for instance, showing a certain tweet or showing a video or showing an image, say, shared by a populist politician to wider audience, and to say, okay, here's the issue with that. But at the same time, again, there's the risk of amplifying it. There's the risk of sort of spreading it to wider audiences. And I'm not really sure where sort of the proper answer is to that. And I don't think there are clear lines for journalists where they can say, okay, here's a fixed rule, and in this case we can cover it and we can sort of share it with wider audiences here, and here's a case where we can't. But it's definitely important to have these conversations, and to bring these conversations to newsrooms and to journalists more broadly, that at least there's an awareness of these problems and that these conversations are being had in news organizations. And I'm not sure if that has been the case 4 years ago. It probably has changed a bit by now, at least, and it seems to have changed from my sort of insider outsider perspective, but there's certainly more that could happen.
And I could be wrong in this, but most of the time when a populist emerges, they kind of catch fire. They seem to be kind of media savvy. People pay attention to them. They might get elected, and then it kind of goes south. It never really seems to be the kind of nostalgic world, you know, the golden era that they promise. And so I wonder if there's some utility in almost the idea of like populist detection, because what happens is, it seems some politicians, they see others do it and they start to modify their style, or they come out of the gate fairly young and they're just really brash and emotional and very kind of divisive. And it's a strategy, but would there be some utility in early kind of visual detection of potential populists that might even help, you know, both voters and journalists kind of decipher, like, oh, we know what's going on here, and the end result probably isn't that good. Ricardo, what do you think about that?
I find that to be a particularly dangerous idea. I saw the question when you first mentioned it, and I tried to react it. I think there are certain signs, and you're probably right in saying that you can diagnose the emergence of a populist earlier. But there are two things that must be considered. The first one is, actually three. The first one is that
Oops, I think you froze.
Oh,
Now
I'm
you're back.
sorry, am I back?
Yeah.
I apologize. So culturally, there are changes on how you represent populism. And also it changed throughout time. So I think that if you freeze one specific idea of how a populist will become, it may be problematic. On the other hand, you also build an idea that all populists are the same, and that they will behave the same, and that they represent the same sort of danger, and that they are like the same type of person. And through visual cues, you would, in a certain way, predetermine in a certain way what that person would do politically. So I find that also a bit strange. And the third thing is that you should not, I believe, it's interesting to look at populist contexts and look at the populist dimension of communications, even by those not defined in themselves as populists. So when you have a populist zeitgeist, you have different actors adapting their discourses, their visual performances, their ways of self-representation to make sense to those specific audiences. So those cues can lead to interpretations on personalities and individuals instead of a broader comprehension of the context in which different politicians and different political leaders are operating. So I look at your idea and I find it particularly dangerous.
Just to briefly jump in on that, I mean, I agree with Ricardo, and I think another problem is also a more practical one, is the question of threshold. Where would you draw the line from sort of which point onwards should a politician build as populist because of their visual style? And I could give you right now a number of German politicians where one would probably say, oh, what they do on Instagram, for instance, that looks populist because, for instance, they are in groups in public. Well, maybe not these days. They sort of show themselves with animals, all this kind of stuff. Sometimes people associate with populist politics, but they are not populist in their politics. It's just in their visual representation. So you get in this quite muddy waters where it's really hard to say, okay, is this person, well, they look populist, but are they actually? And then you have someone else who's actually populist, but probably doesn't present themselves in the same way visually. So I think that's a big problem with this approach.
Jenny, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, and maybe even in comparative context. What kind of leverage could we also get by comparing different countries and different actors?
Yeah, I think Ricardo mentioned the historic context, and I think it would be interesting to look at imagery of populism over time. So is it really so that this is a new communication style, or is it only the technology that has changed, and maybe the visual content is quite similar? Maybe it's a timeless ideology. So that's my response to maybe your first or the previous question. And then to the more comparative studies, I think it would be interesting to look at how parties that are in government communicate, and if it changes when they get more responsibility, and then maybe if you can, or you probably can communicate in a different way when you're in the opposition. So maybe that is one interesting take on this.
Right, and we're seeing, the emergence of populists, or that style, or some kind of adapted version of it in countries that we wouldn't normally, or we wouldn't kind of historically associate with that. And yet it is a tradition. I think your point about history is important. It is a tradition going back and kind of forgotten about in some ways, and then it gets embraced at different points. Let's go to the current moment with digital platforms and social media in particular. Is there something about the populist style that allows them to gain a lot of traction there? Is it kind of removing the journalistic intermediaries? Is there something about the unregulated aspect? You can kind of say almost anything you want. What is it about digital platforms and populists that kind of seem to go hand in hand? And Xénia, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, thanks. Considering social media, it obviously opened up new opportunities for populist political communication, since here populist actors can create excluding messages by the use of strong language related to the elite or the others, and furthermore, they can construct this inclusive atmosphere for their people. And further, populist actors can easily speak and engage with the people by applying this amateur, more people-like anti-elite style. So yeah, social media definitely opened up new opportunities for them. However, as Moffitt argued, and I totally agree with this, we shouldn't we should avoid to fall in the traps of that we consider that social media's direct nature mean an automatic populist nature, or that populists are necessarily good at using it.
Felix, what are your thoughts on the relationship between populism and the digital platforms, and even things like Twitter's and other platforms' decisions to kick Trump off?
The big question we're all trying to understand. Let me briefly talk about the first one. I think generally, I think there is a certain advantage to populists on digital media, purely because it allows them to bypass gatekeepers. or existing gatekeepers, and it sort of tethers them more closely to their supporters and groups of supporters, if you will. But from a visual standpoint, I think the biggest benefit is that visual communication or visual messages, they just travel more easily on digital media in general. That includes messaging services and the big platforms. And that's something you definitely didn't have to the same extent in sort of pre-digital or pre-internet, pre-social media times. And to some extent, the question is of how much of an advantage that gives them, but it certainly means that they can sort of share this content quite easily. And when it comes to Trump, it's a hard question. I'm very skeptical of big platform companies policing speech to some extent, because I personally think that's ultimately a question that should be decided by democratically elected governments or institutions. At the same time, there's of course this argument there's no right to free reach, and Trump he still has other means to express himself. He still has other means to speak, and just because he used to be on Twitter and etc., it doesn't mean he has a sort of a right to be there. But I think, yeah, that's really a question for the people studying this, and not so much for me.
Let's think about methods for a minute. And so we have some qualitative researchers in the roundtable. We have some mixed method, even quantitative researchers. How could we team up in a kind of collaborative way to use kind of the close analysis and description of qualitative with more the generalizability of quantitative? And could we apply it to a question dealing with populism in visual politics? Xénia.
If I can start. So I can imagine two general types of collaborations when it comes to the content analysis. First, qualitative content analysis can highlight those aspects that seem to be especially relevant in visual communication and should be translated into well-defined categories for a quantitative content analysis. And the other possibility can be when qualitative researchers dig deeper into the findings of the quantitative colleagues. For instance, if we find that selfies, casual dress, and other informal elements are more prevalent on Instagram, qualitative investigation can dig deeper how political actors use selfies and casual dress to convey specific messages, and what kind of selfies are used. So studies using mixed methods could make highly valuable contribution to this field, I guess.
Jenny, how do you think a mixed methods approach might work with the study of populism?
Yeah, I think you need a mixed methods approach to measure emotions. And I think emotions are, as I said before, very central to the populist communication style. But I also think it's quite difficult I've tried to measure emotions in several different ways, biometrics and self-reports or content analysis. And I think we need interdisciplinary work, just as also with the computational analysis. And we need a combination that looks at emotions on maybe the individual level, on how people respond to emotional content, but maybe also emotions on a societal level or societal perspective, because emotions can also be collective. And then to reach those, you need to have different types of measurements.
And Ricardo, what are your thoughts? You wrote a paper that was largely qualitative, but I think have thought about some of the interactions that could happen if you worked with someone quantitative.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's the key issue So when Renato and I were working on the paper, I think that one of the most difficult things was exactly discussing methods. And I've been working on images for quite some time, and there's always the issue of methods. And I was just thinking about in 2013, I believe, I took a course at APSA with Jim Johnson on visual analysis. And he was intrigued by the difficulties of studying images and visuals, and the exactly on the methods issue and the lack of collaboration between quantitative and qualitative analysis. So I think that mixed method approach is essential for anything, and especially for visual analysis. And although I think that we should move into a computational analysis, sometimes I fear that we might lose this more interpretive dimension. That's not only qualitative, but interpretive in terms of the way you use qualitative. So I believe that qualitative data can help to establish the frames that are going to be used for broader computational analysis, and to check the adequacy of these analyses, and to produce this time of friction in which you have this broader view and this in-depth view of specific images. And I also think that interpretive analysis on this way is important to look at the aesthetic dimension of images, and not only to the content of images. So sometimes we need to draw from specific images and discuss aesthetic elements. So I believe that this is a good approach. And to conclude, if I may, I would like to make a proposal of a collaboration here. I think, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I believe that we all have at least some fears in terms of methods to analyze images. And I think that there are different backgrounds and different perspectives and different approaches. And I believe that we all have received questions on the systematicity of these, or on the capacity to grasp what we're trying to analyze. I think it would be really rich to organize a collaborative course on methods to analyze images, maybe with lectures from specific scholars working on different, from different perspectives, and try to organize something on those lines on how to analyze visuals and how to analyze images, and provide this variety of methods and approaches, and in order to make the discussion in itself more systematic, in addition to the application, to the employment of the methods in themselves. I think that that's a proposal I would make.
I like it, and I think it's a really necessary one. There's also the issue of, one discipline or even subfield within a discipline or an area kind of having a certain way or known system for analyzing visuals, and then literally a couple degrees of freedom over, the other field doesn't know anything about it. And it might have existed for 10 or 15 or even, several decades. It's really a challenge, I think. But it's obviously the time is really good to start to collate that and to make people more aware of it. Felix, you're in a PhD program now. How are you thinking about methods? I know this is coming up quite a bit as you think about your dissertation and other work, but where's the balance, do you think, between qualitative and quantitative, particularly if we could apply it to visual politics and populism?
I say briefly, I think you need both. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. You really need both to make good and valid findings or conclusions. And I think actually one discipline which is sort of, or could be helpful in analyzing sort of visual politics, is the discipline of film studies, because they've done a lot of work and research, also methods wise, in the last decades really on trying to understand films, and a lot of the stuff we're seeing these days basically takes the film forward. So it's not just images when we talk about visual, it's also sort of short films and short film narratives. And if you think, for instance, of a lot of the visual material that Donald Trump and his supporters produce. I mean, some of that stuff, for instance, takes the format of the trailer, which is clearly a format which sort of comes from cinema and from the world of films. And film scholars have actually developed and spent a lot of thought on how you can analyze these things. And they sometimes sort of sit or stand apart from the communication sphere because they're sort of in their own little bubble. And I think we would do well sort of integrating them more into our work and bringing sort of their methods and their ideas into this debate.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about, interdisciplinarity. So Paul Bowles is in the audience and has done a lot of work across different areas of strategic communication and emotion, and does psychophysiology work. But one of the toolkits of psychophysiology, which may not be known in other areas, is something called the International Affective Picture Show. And it kind of is there with images that go from high to low arousal and maybe positive to negative valence that can reliably evoke emotion in the viewer. So we talk about emotion at different levels. Well, you can show it to an individual, or you can put it on a big platform or on television, and it's probably going to reliably evoke emotion. And there's a lot of work around that. And even in pockets like advertising or other commercial domains, and yet we don't really read across those literatures that much. And so there's existing expertise and kind of knowledge bases that I think an interdisciplinary approach would really kind of enhance and benefit from. Let me go to a question now, and Cesar Martinez asks a question, and this is to methods. How do you gather? What's the best way of gathering visual material? Unlike text, it appears to me that the visual is fleeting and there are not clear databases for researchers, at least in comparison with news articles in sources like LexisNexis. So maybe we could just go around each person. How do you gather your visual material to analyze? And let's start with Xénia.
Well, it's quite a challenge. We gathered the posts and see the status of the post, and if they were photos, we just opened them and coded them.
Okay, Ricardo.
Yeah, since we're dealing with a small empirical amount of empirical data, we also opened them manually, the Instagram, and collected all the images and the links to the videos for something else that we are working on. But we just established the period and collected through links and then opened and coded them.
Jenny?
Yeah, for this study, we collected Instagram photos and not so many, so that wasn't an issue. But in other studies, I've used, software that takes the images or videos from the internet, but then you need a lot of storage. So I guess that's the other issue. Then if you store it yourself, then you maybe need big university servers.
Yeah, I know Young Slick deals with that, and a friend of mine, Devon Shaw in Madison, has got multiple servers just downloading data all the time. Felix, you did a content analysis of COVID misinformation. How did you guys analyze or identify the sample and decide what to analyze?
So basically, we identified the sample from a big corpus of fact-checked misinformation around COVID, and then randomly sampled. I think it was close to 100 cases, but then it was basically what Jenny, Xénia, and Ricardo did. We manually downloaded them, then coded them, which was feasible because the sample size wasn't massive. But if it had been any larger, it would have been problematic.
Right. So, you think about the historical sweep of populism or the international scope of it, where do you start, and how large does your data set have to be before it can really kind of be generalized, for instance. The same issue with visuals around COVID-19. I mean, they're just being produced every day, and the frames seem to shift or evolve, or there's new ones introduced continuously. So where do you kind of start? Where do you stop on that? It's a moving target. Of course, it's still a global pandemic. There's another question on in the chat box. I'm interested in how the self is imagined by public figures, particularly female politicians. And in such a context, how indispensable is it to measure this material and its inclinations? And does the credibility of a kind of quantitative approach reduce or kind of lose some of its authority if predominantly qualitative methods are used? In other words, does the credibility of a study, does it remain high if qualitative methods are used? Anybody want to take that? Ricardo, what do you think?
Sorry, I froze and I didn't listen to the whole question. I apologize.
So does the use of one approach or another really affect the kind of credibility of a study? And are some questions just more appropriate for, say, qualitative methods, and therefore have more credibility by studying it that way?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just because my internet had a problem, so I just listened to the last part. So if you want to go around, and I'll
okay. Jenny, what do you think on that? If you caught all that?
Well, I think you always need both approaches. The quantitative approaches can point out interesting themes that need deeper analysis, and then you could go into the qualitative analysis. So it's never that we have this one method that is best suited for all kinds of research though. So
excellent. And Xénia, do you want the last word on that? You're good. Okay. Well, I think what's showing up in the chat quite a bit too is the need for not only how do you identify a sample and how do you kind of bound it, what are the parameters of it, but also how do you come up with a consistent methodological approach for doing different kinds of visual politics research. And that's kind of, that's both a challenge and an opportunity, I think. And, at this kind of moment of identifying an area, that is so broad that it really calls for some foundational texts and frankly, handbooks. So I'm thinking about editing one. It's going to be a lot of work, but that may be something in the works. And I would encourage other people too, maybe to take more specific approaches on this. And I do think the longitudinal historical dimension is something we overlook a lot in, not just visual research, but in, communication research generally. And I think we can get interesting insights that way. And just to relate one thing I'm working on right now, and then we'll take a break. I'm looking at the rise of nonverbal aggression over time in US presidential debates. And so you have this corpus of readily available materials. A lot of it's on YouTube, where you can go to the C-SPAN archives or order it from the Vanderbilt News Archives. And you can get every single debate. And so it's bound, and that you have an entire data set. And then we're looking at a certain number of variables that would indicate forms of nonverbal or visual aggression. And what we're finding in preliminary analysis so far is that it's almost non-existent until you get to or it's not substantial until you get to 2016. And then it just jumps off the charts. And what it does is it puts Trump in particular, but the populist kind of style, in really stark historical relief, is that this is how different it is. And I think a trend study showing, you know, how low level and kind of polite and civil a lot of the discourse and the interactions were up until a certain point, could tell a really interesting story that everybody doesn't quite realize now under the new normal. Like, okay, that's just the way it is. So I do think research has got a lot to contribute there, and even in public awareness. So let's take a break. You can log off if you want and log back in. We'll come back in about 8 or 9 minutes at 10 after the hour. And I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Betsy Grabe of Indiana University. And we're all looking forward to her talk. So I'll see you soon.